All right. Well, let's shift gears. Speaking of losing things or giving them up, as the case may be, you gave up law.
Yeah, so, I was practicing employment law and commercial litigation, and it wasn't really what I wanted to do. I really wanted to have a commercial practice where I was actually helping entrepreneurs of color start businesses
Oh,
and
yeah.
with their exit strategy. So that's what I really want to do, but I never got to do that.
Why not?
So, well, when you go to a law firm, they just plug you in where they need you.
Point taken.
Yeah. So they needed me in litigation. And then also the partner who was running the corporate department at that time, he really was not feeling anybody with less than 3 years experience coming into the corporate world. He just didn't want to teach anyone.
Yeah.
So, so I was doing litigation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it got to the point where I was singing spirituals in my office.
Wow. Wow.
So, it's bad when white people join in.
Oh. And suddenly I've got this vision of you, well, maybe not an address akin to Fannie Lou Hamer, but singing freedom songs at the water cooler.
Right. When a white person comes up to you and says, okay, oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. I'm like, what? So,
the struggle is real.
It is, yeah. So I was going to open up a soul food restaurant in Denver, and then I got a chance to work in the Clinton White House.
Right.
So I did that. I worked on something called the Initiative for One America. You may have never heard of it. But
Tell us all, and then we'll all know about it.
Yeah, it was cool. So Clinton's idea is that if we just talked to one another and listened, we probably realize that we have a lot more in common than what supposedly divides us.
Again, with this crazy talk.
Yeah.
No.
So that was the initiative. Yeah. So that was the initiative on race. It was about a 2-year effort, chaired by the late great John Hope Franklin. And so they went around. They had different. They encouraged people to have just honest dialogue about race.
Mm-hmm.
New York Times did a whole series on race based on this effort. And then when that ended, the people running it said, "Hey, Mr. President, you need to have something in the White House that continues to explore this issue of racial reconciliation." So that became the Initiative for One America, and that's what I worked on.
Cool.
Yeah. So that was great. And then George W. Bush was not feeling that initiative, so he changed it into the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives. But the reconciliation on race, religion, and ethnicity just didn't really continue under his administration. So
In faith-based. Define irony. But also, equally as funny, a gentleman who was not, 3 years prior, singing freedom songs and spirituals in his office, didn't stay in an office that is, it's all about faith. And you could have sung spirituals everywhere you went.
I know. Well, the president was not interested in me being there, because what happens at the change of an administration is you as a political appointee have to write out your letter of resignation. And shockingly, George W. Bush accepted mine. So even though I was interested, he was not. So that was the end of that story.
Winning?
Exactly.
All right. So post-Bush era, you went back to Denver?
So at that time in my life, my ambition was still to be in politics, and I was thinking about becoming the senator of Colorado at some point in my life.
Okay.
So the question was, do you go back to Colorado and start the process? But I really liked D.C. I don't know if you've spent much time in D.C., but I really liked it. So I was going back and forth, and then I talked to some elders who I really respected, D.C. veterans, and they just said, look, man, you're really nice, so you're not going to go that far here. Yeah. So they said, look, just go back to Colorado. It's a good place to be from. I was like, all right. But at that time, the job market was really slow.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So embarrassingly, I was just watching a lot of daytime television, and it got to the point where I said, I need to read something. So I went to the bookstore, I'm browsing the bookshelves, and I see this book called Southern Food at Home, on the Road in History by John Edgerton. and the book was about 10 years old. And in that book, he wrote that the tribute to African American achievement in cookery has yet to be written. So I thought that was interesting. So I just tracked him down and I asked him if somebody had taken on that project. And he said, for the most part, nobody's really written that story. They've done pieces of it. So with no qualifications at all except for eating a lot of soul food and cooking some, I decided to embark on the journey. And that's what led to the soul food book. It's
a good book. I can't remember what I was doing research for, but I was using your book as part of the research. So, well researched, sir. I appreciate all of your efforts so that I didn't have to put them forth.
Yep, I did that so you didn't have to.
Well done indeed. So, you just wrote another book, given up all of law and policy generally to the wind, and thinking, what next?
Yeah, well, I have to tell you that while I was researching the book, I still had political jobs. So I was doing politics in Colorado. But the real jumpstart to the book was I was working for Colorado's governor, and he decided not to run for a second term.
Okay.
So that's when I just went all in on the soul food book. And so to research that book, I read thousands of interviews of formerly enslaved people just to see if references of food. I read about 500 cookbooks, thousands of newspaper articles.
I love cookbooks.
Yeah, especially the ones that have a lot of head notes and historical context. Those are great. And that's missing in quite a few cookbooks these days.
True. They do a lot of narratives, family stories, which are fun, but still.
And then because I cared about my subject so much, I decided I needed to eat my way through the country. So I went
sweetness!
Yeah. I went to 150 soul food restaurants in 35 cities in 15 states.
Wow, that 35 cities had 150 soul food restaurants?
Oh, yeah.
So, it feels very indelicate and almost non-politically correct, but everywhere you go, Chinese food restaurants, for instance, they all serve the same thing. Is that essentially the same thing for soul food restaurants?
That's an interesting question. So I don't know too much about Chinese. I don't know how much regional variance there is. But there is a core for soul food restaurants, but I found a lot of regional variety.
Okay.
Like there could be different types of cornbread. Like in some places you would get, cornbread square or cornbread wedge. In other places it would be muffins. Some places corn sticks. Other places it would be corn cakes. You'd have
like Jiffy Mix kind of cake?
Like what?
Like a Jiffy Mix kind of cake?
No, like a pancake. Like hot water corn.
Oh, yeah, no, I've never heard of this. Go ahead.
Really? Okay. Yeah, so you find variety in that. For instance, everybody had greens, but some places had collards, other places had turnip, other places had mustard, other places had kale. There would be different kinds of vegetables used. So, for instance, instead of black-eyed peas, a place may have butter beans or limas. Okay. But usually most people had. So, so there is a core, but there was still some variety, regional variety that I saw. Yeah.
So, back to this corn cake situation. Those are just the fried cornbread, right? And it looks... Yeah, okay. All right.
Yeah,
we don't call them corn cakes. They call them something else. I can't remember what the name of it is, though.
Well, it depends on how you make it. So some people call it hot water cornbread.
Yes! There we go.
Yeah. So hot water cornbread is when you just get the cornmeal, some seasoning, and then you add really hot water just to stiffen it.
Sure.
And then you form the patties and you fry it in a light grease.
Right.
But a corn cake can be actually, have flour, baking powder, eggs, and it's almost like a mini pancake. And you also fry that in light grease. So it's a texture thing. It's a little different. Yeah. So, so there's different ways to make it. And some people call them hoe cakes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So. Gotcha. All right. Well, so the food that was available to enslaved Africans at the time of Juneteenth was very difficult to come by, right? So there's no recordation to speak of that would give any sort of inclination as to what they were actually eating at the time, which is to be expected, right? The closest or the most thorough records are around the soldiers. So the ones who were marching through, typically the Union soldiers who actually did have clearer, not necessarily full, but clearer and more complete versions of what it was that they were eating. That was really because of the need to stock from elsewhere, so shipments that were having to come in. And reasonably speaking, the slave owners would have been eating better than the slaves themselves, right? And
depends on the situation.
Go ahead. All right.
It depends. So the only situations where you really had kind of bifurcated feeding systems on a plantation were the really large ones.
Okay.
The ones we think about with like Gone with the Wind stuff. But those were only 40% of the enslaved populations where they lived.
Okay.
For the most part, enslaved people were on small farms with 3 to 5 enslaved people, or in cities with about the same number. And in those situations, master and slave were eating out of the same pot because it didn't make sense economically to have a completely different.
Well, how could you though? I mean, I never think about 3 to 5 slaves on a plantation, as it were.
Yeah, think of it more as a small farm. As a, there's a name for them. It's not. I forgot what they call them. But yeah, think of.
We can look it up later. Okay.
Yeah. So most enslaved people were in that situation. So, the enslaved and the master's family were all eating out of the same pot. So it wasn't a lot of different food. It was really only on the large plantations that happened.
Now I have so many more questions that are outside of your purview. So now I've got to go do a whole nother set of research around race relations and the psychology of slavery on a small farm, because that's wild to me. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but we're gonna move past that for right now,
okay.
And we're gonna. But staying within that same vein of sort of race issues, yeah, the food that I think of when I think of enslaved people is the same food that I think of as being the things that were discarded, the things that the folks in the big White House weren't eating, which is how we would have ended up eating fatback and hog maws and jowls and things that maybe were not the choice cuts. And that as a tradition, as would make sense to me, although I have absolutely no authority behind this statement, makes sense to me that as out of tradition, those things simply would have persisted.
Yeah. So it's more complicated than that. So what I found, and this was a big surprise, because what you just said is pretty much the main narrative for soul food before my book. And I believed it because it made a lot of sense, because especially when you think of food in a racial context. But what I found is that, for the most part, whites and blacks in the South were eating pretty much the same foods. So a lot of the things that we thought was throwaway food or discarded food from the big house, it depended on what foods. So, for instance, chitlins.
Sure.
We always think of chitlins as the ultimate kind of, for us, meaning for black people, kind of food. But there are a lot of references of white slave-owning families eating chitlins and loving it. Yeah. In fact, a lot of white people ate chitlins before it kind of went underground for them in the 1950s. But I don't know if you know this, but there's an annual chitlin strut in Sally, South Carolina. And it was started by white people. Yeah.
Okay, I need to be involved in this. Go ahead.
Yeah. It was started by white people in the early 70s because they just needed a fundraiser for the town. There was some town improvements. And so they chose chitlins. And so every year, thousands of white people and others gather in this town. I have on good authority that you can smell the event at about the 25-mile marker.
No! Oh, my goodness. Well,
they're eating stewed and fried chitlins. So this idea that, there was such hard lines between what different people ate,
sure,
it's just not true. Now, they weren't eating them together because of Jim Crow practices, right?
Right.
But it's really more about place and class than race.
Fascinating. That is fascinating. Well, so why did it go underground for non-black people in the 50s, for whites? I don't understand that.
Well, I think at that time in the South, there was a point when people were all starting to prosper, except
Okay.
for African Americans. I think African Americans were lagging, and so I think a class distinction was placed on chitlins at that time,
Okay.
and so chitlins started to get this poor country vibe rather than something everybody loved. And for whatever reason, a lot of African Americans adopted that vibe too about chitlins, right? And disavowed it
Sure.
and eschewed it. But you still had a number who still embraced it. So it was really just a matter of kind of how people were class strivers and how
Sure.
they wanted to be perceived.
Wild and wacky stuff. I would think that if anything, the watermelon would have been perceived as low class food.
Yeah, but just too many white people eat watermelon. And so watermelon and fried chicken are two of those really weird foods that even though a lot of white people eat them, it acquired a stigma to ridicule blacks. And I'm really fascinated by how that happened and why it happens to certain foods and not others. Because other soul food, as we call it, was caricatured, was used to caricature blacks, but it didn't stick. Like there were a lot of catfish stereotypes that were floating around, as well as barbecue.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, but watermelon and fried chicken are the two that remain toxic. And I just wonder what it is about those foods that allows that to happen, but not the others. Even though a ton of white people eat those foods.
Sure. So, do you have an answer to that? Do you know?
I don't.
Not yet?
I've been looking and looking, and I haven't figured it out. It's just something that doesn't make sense to me. And maybe it's just I need to talk to somebody who's more well-versed in the group psychology of racism.
Ah, yeah.
Because my argument in my soul food book is that the caricature of African Americans through food was meant to dehumanize them. Because a lot of
True.
these stereotypes emerge in the late 1800s as African Americans are starting to assert more social and political viability in American society.
Sure.
So in order to support the argument and the machinery to strip away the rights of African Americans, you had to make us look less than human, infantile, not worthy of these new rights that were granted by the
Reconstruction. Sure.
Reconstruction. So I think it was part of that project. And people outside of the South, white people in control of popular media were all too happy to regurgitate and disseminate all of these negative stereotypes of blacks. So it becomes not a regional culture; it's really part of our national culture.
Fair. Well, so that brings me to another question that I hadn't intended to ask you, which was, how does a guy from Colorado have such an affinity for Southern food?
Well, because Denver, Colorado is the heartbeat of soul food in our nation.
Excuse me? I'm sorry. What?
I have two parents from the South. So my mom is from Chattanooga, Tennessee, and my dad is from Helena, Arkansas. And they met here in Colorado and got married. And so I was born and raised here, but my family raised me on soul food.
Okay.
So that was the tradition. My mom was a very good cook, so she could make a lot of different foods.
Sure.
But soul food was the food that I was typically eating.
Asking for,
eating, on special occasions. That's what we had. So I grew up eating greens and black-eyed peas on New Year's Day.
as you should.
Right. Well, a lot of people, when they get out of the South, they kind of shed these attachments. And again, it's about class striving, right? It's that you don't want to look country, or you want to be accepted by the new people around
Look, you call it what you want. It's good. It's tasty. And I don't eat them so much as I believe the old wives' tale about how, you'll never be broke if you have, there'll always be the paper bills if you eat the cabbage, and you'll always have at least the change if you have the black-eyed peas. It's just good. And it's as much a tradition as having turkey on Thanksgiving to me.
Right. Well, that's interesting that you picked out cabbage, because really, cabbage is strong in Louisiana. But when you get outside of Louisiana, you have other greens. So I'm happy that you said cabbage. That shows your Louisiana roots.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Right.
But so Well, yeah. So I mean, winter greens. I guess you could have all kinds of greens on New Year's Day, right? So collards, turnips, the mustards. All well, are there any more? Yeah.
Kale.
Okay. So talk to me about this kale situation. Is kale a new thing? Is kale a newly discovered thing? Is kale a new superfood that has simply been popularized in recent years? Help me with kale.
So kale goes way back. It's been around for thousands of years. In African American culture, kale is really popular on the eastern seaboard,
Okay.
especially in the Maryland area. So we have a long tradition of eating kale. So when I give talks on soul food, I tell people, hey, if you've been introduced to kale in the last 10 to 15 years, welcome to the party, because we've been eating them for about 300.
Okay.
So I think it is part of this. We've seen this dynamic before, where certain people outside our community discover foods that we've been eating and find out how nutritious they are, and then they're deemed superfoods. So kale is now such. Okra is now a superfood.
Oh, is it really?
Oh yeah, just recently has been deemed a superfood.
I missed that. But, you know, you put it in a Bloody Mary, pickle it. I don't know that it's so super anymore. Well, at least not for the right reasons.
Yeah, but it's still got a lot of vitamins.
True story. My aunt Willie Lee makes the best smothered okra with tomatoes and shrimp. Oh my God. She's the only reason that I ever decided to eat the okra, because they were so slimy. I hated them in gumbo.
Nice. Did you get the recipe?
Yes.
Really? She gave it to you?
Yeah.
Oh. Okay.
If you ever want to come to Opelousas, well, not come. We'd have to meet there because it's a ways away. She's still there making her, and it's the same cast iron skillet that has been sitting on the stove since, I don't know, 73. It just, it leaves the stove to get cleaned. It comes back to the stove.
Nice. Well, I actually know somebody from Opelousas.
No, really?
Yeah, there's a guy from Opelousas who's here in Denver. He goes to my church, and he runs a barbecue joint there.
Wow.
Yeah.
The world gets smaller every day.